A common question that we usually get is, especially from front-end developers, is where does all the markup come from? And that's an obvious question, because as a front-end developer, you want to control the markup and being able to style it upon your needs. So let us put this just as a little graphic here. So everything in Sitecore usually starts with a layout, and SXA ships an out-of-the-box layout, which is called SXA layout.cshtml. And in there, you don't find too much. It's a quite slim layout. What you find in there is mainly three placeholders. On the one hand, we have a head placeholder, which represents everything that goes within your head tags of the HTML. And then you have a body top placeholder and a body bottom placeholder, which allows you to also add renderings, or in this case, meta renderings, to directly underneath the opening body tag or directly above the closing body tag. So, and in addition to that, especially then for the content maintenance purpose, it loads another grid body, which is dependent on the grid that we've chosen on the site creation. So in our case, we have chosen the Bootstrap 4 grid, and therefore it will load the Bootstrap 4 body.cshtml file, which again doesn't contain much beside then 3 additional placeholders, which are meant then for our content maintenance. So on the one hand, we have a header placeholder, then we have a main placeholder, and we have a footer placeholder. So usually, well, in the header placeholder, we place everything that goes into the header of the website, could be our logo and navigation and things like that. And then in the footer, of course, everything goes in there that is commonly used in the footer across our website. We have used that already in one of the earlier tutorials. And in the main is where we put mainly all the content. So that's where content authors work and where they manage their content. So that's the first part of the whole markup that you can get coming from the layout and the grid body. And of course, then you add your components to the page, which always have a view file. And then if you go for a view or a rendering that supports rendering variants, then you get also whatever is defined in the variant definition item as a markup to your page. So that's basically the whole structure of how and where your markup comes from.
Now, as a front-end developer working on SXA projects, I seldom, if ever, am trying to update any of the actual HTML that's coming from the main overall SXA layout or the grid systems layout file, because that stuff is really boilerplate that's just creating the general overall structure of the site. And really all the meat of what I want to render and control are coming from the view for each rendering variant that I'm rendering to actually put content and put navigation on the page. So seldom, if ever, are we editing anything that comes from these files. And it is strongly recommended to try to leave these files vanilla if you can, because you can usually accomplish all your goals without having to directly edit anything in them.
True. Definitely for the SXA layout, it's strongly recommended not to touch it, because it also is the basis for a lot of SXA functionalities that come out of the box. So if you start changing something, you might lose functionality within it. As it is owned by SXA, it might be overwritten with the next upgrade. So be very careful when you touch it. If you find a reason where there's no other way out than touching this file, definitely document that well, so that you know for the next upgrade that there's something you need to take a look at. But other than that, well, if you touch it, search for, or if you're planning to touch it, search for an alternative solution. We really strongly recommend not to do so. Well, also to add up on the view file for any renderings, what I commonly see as a feedback is that, especially from an architectural perspective, the projects want to be independent of whatever SXA is changing on the components, even though I haven't seen SXA changing anything on those components that are offered so far, especially in the view file, since the last, I don't know, whatever releases. I mean, I haven't seen them changed anytime. Nevertheless, I can understand that you want to decouple from what is SXA owned and therefore have your own view file. So what I can recommend is on the one hand, either create yourself some kind of generic view file for your project that you can reuse. And one other requirement that I see every once in a while is that the view files that are provided with the out-of-the-box components have a structure of two diffs. On the one hand, a diff that uses some kind of decorator to make use of the functionality to set the grids or have the style items being used and all of that. And then a second diff that is inside of the first one, which just have assigned the class component content. So most front-end developers that I see wonder if this is really necessary, and they would like to get rid of it. That's at least the feedback that I get. Not sure if it's really harming, but yeah, if you want to get rid of that, I would recommend just creating yourself an own generic view file that supports rendering variants and that just iterates through your rendering variant definition. And then you don't have to create a view file that's exactly the same like the other. And you have to multiply that and take care of it and so on. So you just reference each time the same one and handle your whole markup within the variant definition. Cool. So one thing that we haven't talked about so far is the grid framework. So as I said, we have chosen the out-of-the-box Bootstrap 4 grid framework. And just to be clear here, this Bootstrap 4 grid framework only contains whatever you need for constructing your site in terms of the grids. It doesn't contain all the CSS that you would also get from Bootstrap if you download the CSS and JavaScript files to style your Jumbotron or to style whatever component Bootstrap provides out of the box. So this is all excluded to keep it as small as possible. And if you go for that to find the grid theme, in there you will find then a style folder containing the source files of the style and of course an optimized min file. And in addition to that, a grid contains or is containing two other items, or yeah, on the one hand, it's a grid definition item, which allows you to set up all the information that you need in order to set up your grid. So if you go for a rendering and you click on in Experience Editor on this little paint pot icon, then you get into a dialog where you are able to set, for example, the size dependent on your device, or better set on the screen resolution. So all that is configured in your grid definition item. So as you can see here, we have the compact phones and we have the phones and tablets and laptops and desktops configured, but you could also change that, or meaning if you need to change that, you would rather create your own grid theme and therefore also your own grid definition item and perform whatever changes you need to perform. So in each of those, let's say, device items here, you will find then all the other settings that you can do, setting, for example, the size of the component, and then in here you would have a in the or under the size item, you will have then all the options that are or that can be used in the drop down, like the grid sizing from 0 to 12 or from 1 to 12, and then also all the other options that you find on the advanced tab.
So just to zoom out to an even bigger picture of why we're defining grid systems, SXA themes inherently have the concept that you're going to be using a grid of some type. It comes with a bunch of out-of-the-box grid systems. You get to select one of those specific ones, or you could clone one of those specific out-of-the-box grid systems and make your own new version of it if you wanted to really customize the details of the grid system. And when we say the details of the grid system, the whole reason that SXA themes have the concept of theme of grids built into them is because out of the box, SXA allows you as a content editor or an administrator to define arbitrary grid structures. It comes with out-of-the-box components that let you make grid rows and grid columns. you get to define the sizes of those columns, usually in a 12-column system, because that's become the most common way that people use grids these days. But what Sebastian is showing us here and what he was just outlining is the fact that you could clone something like the out-of-the-box Bootstrap 4 grid, thus make your own grid system that you can use in your SXA themes. And then under your grid system, you get to define what are the breakpoints at which I can change the sizing of my grid columns. And then under each of those breakpoints, you can define all the available choices for the sizes. So you could really go into deep detail and make your own custom grid system. I don't seldom see that on SXA projects. Usually people are just selecting the most modern one that comes out of the box, which in the current case is Bootstrap 4, but you could go to that level of detail if you wanted to. And a final thing you could do if you decide to go that level of detail is there is some boilerplate HTML containers that show up around grid structures automatically. That little boilerplate HTML tag and the class that goes on it is something that's defined on these grid items that we're looking at. So if you duplicated one of them and made your own custom grid system, you could also go and customize those details to come out the way that you want.
Yes, and another option is, for example, if you need to touch the grid view file, you can also, or you're also invited to copy one of the existing ones just to assign your customized view file to the, or for the body grid, let's say, to your grid definition item. Last but not least, we haven't talked about the last item here, which is the grid setup item. And this one contains at the end just the name, how it's going to be displayed in the list or in the drop down that you see when you create a new site and you're able to select the grid framework of your choice. So by having this item, you can choose how this is being named in this kind of drop down. Just to mention, there's also a very well documented way of how to create a custom grid. So it's a topic of minutes, I would say, as you would anyway probably start off just copying one of the grid frameworks or grid themes that is closest to what you want to achieve, and then performing your adjustments. So one thing we haven't seen in the graphic before is that also for your placeholders, you have a certain markup available, and this is defined on your grid definition item. So if you go to the placeholder styles section or to the placeholder wrapper section, you see what would be rendered in terms once you have a placeholder available. So yeah, there would always be a div in this case, and this is the default case here, with the class row. So this is what you can rely on basically. And if you need this also to be changed for whatever reasons, again, just make a copy of the existing Bootstrap 4 and call it custom Bootstrap 4, whatever, and use this one instead for your sites. Great. So if we take a look at the view of such a component, and we've discussed it already, you can see that the view doesn't do much. So on the one hand, of course, I'm loading a few things here, but the most important stuff I would say happens in here. So here are the two mentioned divs that you get with every rendering or with every out-of-the-box rendering in SXA. And if you compare the view file for rich text editor rendering with a promo rendering, for example, you will see that it's more or less exactly the same. The only thing that is done is the default here that is used once you do not have assigned a CSS class to the rendering or to the rendering item directly. It will fill it up here with this default. So other than that, this whole decorator that you see here is managing all the inclusion of or the usage, for example, of the grid system that we just showed on the slide before, or if you make use of the style items in SXA, then also this is going to be injected through this decorator. So if you delete this line here, then you're not being able to use those functionalities anymore, because simply those classes are no longer rendered into your div.
And almost none of the HTML that's output for most components will be found in this CS HTML view files.
Yes.
Almost all of the HTML output for the guts of the component, including its fields of content and any additional containers that go around those fields, that stuff is all defined through configuration in Sitecore admin. So you don't ever need to go in and edit these view files directly if you want to affect that main stuff that renders for each component in each rendering.
Yes, and therefore you have also then the for each loop here. This is exactly the position where where you're looping through the rendering variant definition and through all the items that you have set up there. Or if you use Scriben, for example, then it takes whatever you have provided in the Scriben template and puts it into the view dynamically. So that way, well, as Andrew said, you don't have to touch this view file at all. You can define everything or most of it in rendering variants. Well, as I said, you can create your own one just to be decoupled from any changes that SXA might do, just for that theoretical case. And what you can also do if you're using Scriben, which we will cover in another tutorial, you could even handle this line here with a decorator in Scriben, so you don't need any div at all anymore, just this for each loop. And then there is a SC function or the Scriben function introduced with SXA that handles then this decorator for you. So even you strip down you strip out even more of that view file and handle even more than in your Scriben renderer and in the rendering variants. Great. So coming to rendering variants, just quickly, I think we have talked about over it already in a previous tutorial. Nevertheless, that is then the last step where your markup is defined, either as you can see here for the default variant definition in some field renderers or section renderers, or as I said, with 9.3, we got Scriben introduced as a new scripting language and templating engine, and therefore you can also define your markup now using Scriben instead of multiple items. So that's the whole structure of where your markup might come from. If you are looking for where it comes from, then most probably from one of the places that you have seen here in that presentation.
And as a front-end developer, I see the adjustments I might want to make to the HTML output as follows. For each component that the design shows or that somebody wants me to front-end theme, I'm usually quickly considering, along with the other devs on the project, if any of the out-of-the-box SXA renderings already serve that goal. If they do, I'd probably try to start with that and see if I could simply theme that existing HTML markup the way that it's needed. If I figure out from that process that none of the out-of-the-box stuff suits my goal, or that I want to make a custom one for any other reason, I can either go to any of the out-of-the-box components, like the promo one that's shown in this screenshot, and make a new rendering variant under it. So I can make my own new rendering variant in addition to the default one that came out of the box, where I fully control what fields of content appear under that variant, what order they appear in the HTML, and freely create any number of other HTML containers that I want around those fields. So I could do that, or I could maybe, if I need to be even more advanced in that for some reason, although I haven't found much reason to have to resort to this, I could talk to the Sitecore developer on the project and say, can we define a completely new rendering that's not one of the out-of-the-box ones so we can control something else about it, perhaps make it do something more dynamic on the back end that some of these other out-of-the-box components don't do in and of themselves. That's also an option if you have to go to that level. But in almost all cases where your goal is to just manipulate the HTML output, you can usually just create a new rendering variant for your goal and make the HTML come out however you see fit.
Cool. So yeah, so that's the end of our little tutorial episode of today. And I hope you liked it. I hope you learned it, and see you in the next episode.